Running the app in a browser is awesome, but there are times when you might want to use a true emulator. I'm going to show you how to run using the Android emulator. Now, before you can run this using the Android emulator, you must have the Android SDK installed on your machine. I'll warn you in advance, installing the Android SDK is not a trivial process. The installation of the Android SDK or iOS SDK is beyond the scope of this course. I would probably have to take at least 20 minutes to show you the installation for the Android SDK alone here. Instead, let me point you to a few links. First, on the Ionic installation page, which you can see here, there are some helpful notes for installing on Linux and on Windows. So if we click these red buttons here, we'll get some notes for Linux. On Windows, you see some notes here as well. I strongly recommend you read all of this in detail and make sure you've done all these steps. Also, on this tab right here, which you can see is on the Ionic CLI FAQ, we have a section here for Android SDK. It points out a blog post, even some emulator alternatives, and also an in-depth YouTube tutorial for how to do it. Since you can follow along with this YouTube tutorial, this is another reason why I'm not going to repeat that content in this course here. Again, just make sure you followed all the steps. Once we have the Android SDK installed, we're ready to run the emulator. The first thing I'm going to do is Ionic platform add Android. And this will add Android-specific resources to our project such that it can run in a native environment. And we have this folder in here called Platforms. You can see I have one for Android and not iOS because we only did the Add Android platform. And this added these resources that you can see here in this Platforms folder. The other thing we can do next is Ionic build Android. And this will go through the compilation steps for the Android platform. And you can see it's using the Android SDK to compile the project. Now that that's done, we're ready to launch the emulator. So we'll type Ionic emulate Android. And we can see that we now have our app running in the emulator, Ionic 2 Pluralsight we see right here. And we can navigate to these other screens, clicking the tabs at the bottom. So there's the About screen, the Contact screen, and the Home screen. Remember, the emulator will provide a more native environment to test your app in comparison to just running it in a desktop browser.